Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would finally give my little fight prediction on the very decent fight or the big fight that is going to be happening this weekend between Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez and Gennady Triple Golovkin. And of course, for those of you that don't know, this is the rubber match between the two. And by rubber match, of course, for those of you that are not familiar with that term, what that means basically is that of a trilogy match. This is the third match between the two gentlemen. Of course, the first time the match had occurred, I believe that it was a draw. I personally thought, and still to this day, believe that Gennady Golovkin deserved to win the first fight out of the two. And then the second fight was very competitive as well. And I believe that it was a unanimous decision or a majority decision to Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez. And I thought that Canelo Alvarez did deserve to get the rematch. Ever since then, of course, they kind of went their own separate ways. Canelo Alvarez has became a champion at the 168-pound division and also at 175, at least at one point in time. And Gennady Golovkin has pretty much stayed at the middleweight division, maybe went up to 168 once or twice. I can't necessarily remember, but I believe that he probably just stayed at 160 because I believe that he has two out of the four official belts there. So it's going to be very interesting. But anyways, Mr. Gennady Golovkin overall is going to be going up, I believe, the 168 pounds against Mr. Canelo Alvarez this Saturday. And this is going to be a very particularly interesting fight. Now, of course, Canelo Alvarez is more than likely going to be the overwhelming favorite over Mr. Gennady Golovkin. Or if I had to guess, he's at least going to be a 3-1 favorite, if not even a little bit more. Now, for those of us, if we just take a look at it on the surface, and if we don't take a look at many other circumstances, we can say that Canelo Alvarez should probably be maybe even a 7-1 to 5-1 favorite. But for those of us, of course, that know that these two gentlemen, that this is going to be the third time that they have fought, that they are overall, both of them, very desperate to win this fight, this could be a very close fight. I would not be surprised if Gennady Golovkin somehow made it competitive, not necessarily because it should be super competitive. I think that Canelo Alvarez should make this fight, probably the biggest domination out of any of the three fights that Canelo Alvarez was able to have over Gennady Golovkin. But you just never truly know. Now, Gennady Golovkin, when I seen him within his past few fights against Sergey Derevyanchenko, and when I seen him against that one Japanese fighter, I don't necessarily remember the dude's name, and even against another fighter, Gennady Golovkin, in my view, ever since that Canelo Alvarez rematch, ever since Gennady truly, I think, in somewhat of a degree, believes that he could have potentially lost that fight. And those two wars with Canelo Alvarez, I don't think that he's ever looked the same ever since overall after that rematch with Canelo Alvarez. And that includes now. Now, maybe Gennady Golovkin, is it possible that maybe he's been saving himself up for that final Saul Canelo Alvarez battle? Because I believe that there really is no other fight that truly interests Gennady Golovkin at this point in time. I think whether he wins or loses this fight, there's a very decent chance that he may retire. Maybe all in all, if he wins against Canelo, maybe they have a fourth fight. Maybe they don't. I don't necessarily know. But I think Gennady Golovkin has been waiting for Canelo Alvarez for a while now. Not only because of revenge and a certain amount of other things, and that's really the only fight that interests him, but he knows he's going to get a whopping payday against Canelo Alvarez, and that's why a certain amount of people want Canelo in the first place. Not only does he have the prestige with his resume, but he also has the money. He is the biggest attraction in all of boxing today. Just is what it is. But anyways, if you had to ask me personally, who do I think is going to win this fight and why? I do have to go with Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez. Many, many years ago, when these two fighters were at the peak of their career, and Canelo still is someone at the peak of his career, but we'll have to see how he handled that loss to Dmitry Bivol. But when Gennady Golovkin was also at the peak of his career, and when Gennady Golovkin was an undefeated fighter, I predicted Gennady Golovkin to win the first fight. In my view, I thought that Gennady Golovkin did win the first fight, but there were certain faults that I've seen with Gennady Golovkin, certain things that, in my view, he did not execute well enough on Mr. Canelo Alvarez, where I said, you know what, if Canelo is able to actually go forward on Gennady Triple G Golovkin, and if he is actually able to adjust to a certain degree, which more than likely he will, because at that time, that was when Canelo Alvarez, in my view, was starting to slightly improve as a boxer, fight by fight. And I think the first time that when I really seen Canelo Alvarez, and I said, wow, he is truly adjusting as a fighter, was when I seen him against Miguel Cotto. Miguel Cotto, for those of you that don't remember that fighter, one of my all-time favorite fighters to watch. What Miguel Cotto is, in my view, kind of like a Sugar Shane Mosley or an Oscar De La Hoya, except he may even have been better than them by a little bit. Well, with Oscar De La Hoya would have been debatable. But anyways, when it comes down to it, what Miguel Cotto was, just like a De La Hoya or a Sugar Shane Mosley, he was what you call an all-time great gatekeeper or someone on the know that is a Hall of Fame gatekeeper. Now, what do I mean by that? Does not mean necessarily saying that, he didn't win any of his big fights, but what I am saying is this. Miguel Cotto was almost kind of like a person that, guards you from going into the pearly gates. Like if you were to use this analogy, if you were to overall go up into heaven, he's kind of the one that decides whether you get in or whether you don't. Well, there's certain fighters on the know that are like that. Miguel Cotto was one of those fighters. Miguel Cotto, if you were not able to beat him, you were not overall going to be one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters. But overall, if you were, that meant all in all that you usually had the goods, whether you were going to be a Manny Pacquiao or Floyd Mayweather Jr. or a Canelo Alvarez, or unless you were just bigger or had certain athleticism on your side, Miguel Cotto was not usually going to be beat by anyone else. And that's why he beat Sugar Shane Mosley, Antonio Margarito, Zab Judah, I believe whoever the hell that one other Puerto Rican fighter was that he beat early on in the day when they were both undefeated. That's who Miguel Cotto was. Well, Canelo was one of the few that was able to completely outbox Miguel Cotto. So it just is what it is. But I remember that fight. Overall, in Canelo, ever since then, I thought that he went on a massive improvement. And then overall in the two Gennady Golovkin fights, and when I seen him in that rematch, I said, wow, this kid is really starting to improve. And he may eventually become the face of boxing, and eventually he did. But anyways, at the end of the day, enough overall of that of that overall little speech when it comes down to it. The big question is, who do I think is going to win this fight and why? I believe that Canelo Alvarez is going to win the fight, and the reason why that is because Canelo Alvarez should be the younger and should be the fresher fighter of the two. He, of course, has shared his, share of dominance in the past several years. Overall, he should have more confidence going into this fight. And I just do not believe that Gennady Golovkin is the same fighter as what he used to be. I don't think that he has the same punching power. I don't think that he has the same punch resistance. I don't think all in all that he has the same pace of speed. And he never was a fighter that was super duper quick. But he was a fighter all in all that maybe was a bit faster than what he is now. I just don't think that Gennady Golovkin has what it takes to beat a great talent like that of a Canelo Alvarez at the current moment in time. Or I shouldn't say that he doesn't have what it takes. But if Canelo Alvarez shows up in the best form possible, I do not see this version of Gennady Golovkin beating that of a Canelo Alvarez. I just don't see it. And the reason why that is because Canelo, in my view, at this point in time in his career, he pretty much has reached his peak. And if you're going to beat someone like a Canelo Alvarez, you're going to have to be either A, debatably, the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in all the boxing like Floyd Mayweather Jr. was, or B, you're not only going to have to be a very talented boxer, but you're also going to have to be somewhat bigger than him, like what a Dmitry Bivol was. And Gennady Golovkin, in my view, he just doesn't have those attributes, at least not anymore. At one point in time, in my view, he was debatably one of the top 5 boxers in all of pound-for-pound boxing, but he's just not that anymore. And some may even debate that he is not even a top 20 pound-for-pound boxer, but that really is up to you. Listen, what I'll state is this. In my view, Canelo Alvarez, he should win this fight by a wide decision, maybe by unanimous decision. I would say that more than likely he is going to win it by unanimous decision. But if it ended up being a split decision or a majority decision, I would not be shocked. And the reason why that is once again, because from the surface, of course, it looks like Canelo Alvarez should dominate this fight. But they both have fought each other a multitude of times when it comes down to it. And on top of that, Gennady Golovkin, even though he does not have the same athleticism or overall the same pace as what he once did, he still is a decently intelligent fighter. He is a person that can counter very well. He still has a very, very decent jab, and he does have decent punching power. Do I believe that it'll be enough against Canelo Alvarez this up-and-coming Saturday? More than likely not, but you just never know. Now, key is overall to win the fight, in my view, for either fighter. I think what Canelo Alvarez has to do is basically the same strategy as what he had in the rematch. I think he needs to use his jab. I think he needs to come in mostly on Gennady Golovkin and make him uncomfortable. And what you especially need to do very early on is overall go to that body early on. Because not only was Gennady Golovkin uncomfortable against Canelo Alvarez with that early body attack in both fights, and especially in that rematch. That's why he backed up so much against Canelo Alvarez when he did not back up against other fighters. When it came down to it, Canelo needs to use his hand speed. He needs to use overall his ability to move in and out. And sometimes Canelo, if we were to talk about one of his very few weaknesses, sometimes he could do that a little bit better, because I think sometimes his feet could be a little bit better. But other than that, Canelo Alvarez's skill set is pretty much spotless, at least mainly, especially against fighters his own same size. But Canelo Alvarez is going to have to move in and out. He is mainly going to have to pressure Gennady Golovkin. I would like to see jabs and uppercuts to the body, hooks to the body very early on from Canelo Alvarez, push him back with that jab, overall try to hide, overall that right cross behind the jab, set up certain traps, move in and out, but you are going to have to pressure Gennady Golovkin and make him uncomfortable. Because what Gennady Golovkin mainly likes to do is that he likes to pressure. Not saying that he can't fight on the back foot, but I just don't know if he's going to be able to handle Canelo Alvarez's speed to the degree to where he would be able to outbox him going off the back foot, at least to a certainty, because Canelo, he's a very good defensive fighter. Not even just a very good defensive fighter, he is a great defensive fighter. It's very hard to hit Canelo Alvarez at this point in time in his career. And the reason why Dimitri Bivol, in my view, was able to hit him so many times was not only overall because he's an extraordinary boxer and bigger than him, but it was very obvious to me that Canelo Alvarez was not in the shape that he needed to be in, or B, he could have overall gained a little bit too much muscle mass because he could barely keep his hands up throughout the whole entire fight. He was so exhausted, but it is what it is. So Canelo is also going to have to show up in very, very decent shape for this fight. He's going to have to go to the body early, go up top overall with that right cross, which seemed to work a couple of times overall, or quite a bit in their two matches. So overall, I would give the plan to Canelo that overall you do need to probably go to the body early because Golovkin seems to be uncomfortable. And then from there on, you might be able to outbox him or slowly break him down. What would I advise for Mr. Gennady Golovkin? Well, more than likely, Canelo Alvarez is going to try to come at you. So what Gennady needs to do is that he needs to try to out-jab Mr. Canelo Alvarez, jab to the body, jab to the head, try to overall hit him with the right cross to the body, or overall try to hide that right cross behind, a hidden jab when it comes down to it. And Gennady Golovkin also is going to have to move a little bit more than what he did probably in the rematch. And Gennady, in my opinion, has never been necessarily a bad mover, but sometimes he's a little bit more stiff than what he needs to be, especially because he used to rely so much on his punch resistance and so much on his power. Well, that's not necessarily there to the degree of what it once was. So Golovkin may not look as good in this fight as what he did in his past fights, and that's why we're starting to see overall certain fighters, even fighters that are probably not on his level, nowhere near on his level of what he used to be, they're starting to hurt him and they're starting to hit him and give him much tougher fights than once predicted. And the reason why that is because Gennady Golovkin, even though he was never a bad fighter, he does sometimes rely a little bit too much on his punch resistance overall and his power. And certain fighters that do that, they're so used to bullying certain fighters that when some attacks, smart attacks come back at them, they're like, holy shit, this is actually coming back at me, and I usually don't have to experience this. What do I do? And we've seen this with the Mike Tyson. We've seen it with the Deontay Wilder. Now, Golovkin didn't necessarily freeze up overall like those fighters did against their greater competition, like when Golovkin faced Canelo. But at the end of the day, it was enough to lose. So Gennady Golovkin does need to step it up a little bit, but I just don't know if he's going to be able to beat Canelo Alvarez. It's going to be very, very particularly interesting. Both fighters are going to have to move in and out. Golovkin is going to have to fight a little bit on his back foot, and more than likely, there's going to be certain times to where he is probably going to have to try and force Canelo Alvarez overall to go back. I would say that if this were a Golovkin from 5 years ago, that maybe you try to push Canelo Alvarez a little bit more forward behind that jab, using the jab a little bit more and going to the body, and that is another thing as well. Even though Gennady Golovkin has never been a bad body puncher, he did not seem overall comfortable to do that with Mr. Canelo Alvarez for whatever reason. And maybe it's the counter-punching ability and the power of Canelo. Almost no fighter overall, besides Floyd Mayweather Jr., is ever usually comfortable going into the body of Canelo Alvarez. Gennady is going to have to go to the body to Canelo Alvarez to even stand a chance in this fight, in my opinion. He's going to have to stick that jab in his body constantly. He's going to have to stick that lead crawl in Canelo Alvarez's body constantly. He's going to have to go down with the right if you have him up against the ropes. get him with a good uppercut or get him with a good hook in combination to the body. All right, it's going to be very interesting. So that means, jab to the face, maybe a double jab, maybe a right to the body, then a left. You're going to have to mix it up a little bit. But Gennady Golovkin's going to have a body attack as well. But Gennady, unfortunately, because of his age, he's probably going to have to do a little bit more boxing on the back foot in this fight than what he's going to on the front foot. Because I'm not quite sure if his age is going to allow him to get in an all-out war with Canelo like what he did in the first two fights. But it's going to be very interesting. But anyways, I have Mr. Canelo Alvarez winning this fight by unanimous decision. It would not surprise me if Canelo Alvarez got the knockout. It would not even shock me if somehow Gennady Golovkin ended up getting a knockout, although I would be heavily surprised. There is a certain amount of people, of course, stating that Gennady should not have that much of a chance in this fight. But let's also give Gennady Golovkin a little bit of a chance. Do not underestimate him. And that also is a warning to Canelo Alvarez, because if Canelo Alvarez underestimates Gennady Golovkin, and if he ends up losing to him, more than likely his career is over. And a certain amount of people may say his career is over. What do you mean? Because he could still have many, many other fights, yes. But what I mean by that is that he will never be at the same prominent place ever again. Because Canelo Alvarez is not just some ordinary boxer. You see, when you have a boxer like an Adrian Broner, or when you have a boxer like someone that, did not have as high as expectations as some of these other fighters, it's different overall when they lose versus when someone that is looked at as the number one pound for pound fighter loses. If you usually notice, certain fighters, that were once upon a time looked at as number one pound for pound fighters, when they lose, they're almost never mentally the same again, especially if they end up losing by knockout, or certain fighters that had such a high level of confidence and then they're knocked out, they're almost never the same fighter ever again. Whether it be Sergey Kovalev, or whether it overall be, Gennady Trilogy Golovkin after Canelo, or whether it be, Deontay Wilder after, Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua after Alexander Usyk, and even to a degree, Andrew Ruiz. Anderson Silva, when he ended up getting knocked out against Chris Weidman, he was never the same. He was never the same fighter again after that. And there's a multitude of UFC examples of that as well. When Chuck Liddell ended up losing to Quentin Rampage Jackson, he was never the same fighter ever again after that. So being on top overall for such a long time and losing a fight all in all that you truly do not expect to lose, and then you lose another one after that, that's a complete confidence shattering, incident. So Canelo Alvarez cannot look past Gennady Golovkin. I know that he states that he wants to get the knockout and all that sort of stuff. Hopefully, Mr. Canelo Alvarez, at least for his sake, hopefully overall he is not looking past Gennady Golovkin. I don't believe that he is. Canelo has not seemed to look past any opponent, but he needs to treat Gennady Golovkin like any dangerous opponent that he has ever had in his career. Now, is this the same Gennady Golovkin from 4 or 5 years ago? No, it is not. But he needs to treat Gennady Golovkin like he is the most dangerous fighter that he's ever stepped in the ring with. Because if he underestimates him, that's going to be very, very hard to recover from Canelo. In fact, he may never recover from that. So it's going to be very, very particularly interesting. As for Golovkin, if he loses this fight, he's pretty much going to take the payday and pretty much ride off into the sunset with a decently great career. Not an all-time great career in my opinion, but a decently great career. So it's going to work out on both ends. We'll see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. I'm very excited for this fight because Canelo Alvarez did lose his last fight, in my opinion, to Mr. Dimitri Bivol 8-4, so somewhat dominantly. So it's going to be very interesting to see overall how Canelo Alvarez comes back, because you have to build up a fighter very carefully. And even after this fight, if he does win this fight, he may not want to rematch Dimitri Bivol immediately. In fact, he may overall just want to stay away from 175, possibly forever, but maybe just for a while. It could be maybe smart overall to face someone like a Jamal Charlo or David Benavidez before you truly get into the ring with the 175-pounders again, if you even decide to again. But that's up to him. We'll see overall what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. I just thought that would be very particularly interesting. But anyways, overall, I'm going to go with Canelo Alvarez by unanimous decision. Wouldn't be surprised at all if there was a knockout. Canelo more than likely probably should get the knockout, but I'm going to give Golovkin a little bit more leeway. I'm going to give him a little bit more confidence in this fight because he has had such a tough fight, or tough amount of fights, with Canelo Alvarez in the past. And once again, we have to remember, certain fighters that have fought each other a multitude of times, they're always usually going to have tough fights with each other. Take a look at Manny Pacquiao versus Juan Manuel Marquez, for example. When Marquez fought Manny Pacquiao for that 4th time, I believe that a lot of people thought that Manny was going to easily take the fight, and then Marquez ended up knocking him out. So we have to be very careful. Canelo has to really not look past Golovkin here. It's going to be very interesting. But I'm going to go with Canelo by unanimous decision. I just think that he's a little bit too skilled right now, and I think that he's even gotten better ever since the Gennady Golovkin rematch. But it's going to be interesting. Time will tell. It's going to be interesting. But that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.